One of the basic moves in the Army combative system is very much like Karate's Jodan Agyuke, except instead of being a block against a punch like this, what we're doing is coming in this way and hitting into the carotid sinus with that hand there. My name is Bryson Keenan. I'm a former Australian serviceman who later went on to a career in international corporate security. I've been training in the martial arts since 1968 when I was a young lad. Firstly in judo and karate. Started goju-ryu in 1972, and I'm currently training under Taira Masaji Sensei of the Okinawa goju-ryu Kenkyukai. So I started as a 9-year-old in 1968. My father was a former British merchant marine who'd been all over the world and wanted to have his skinny little son do some training and become a bit more burly than I was at the time. So he put me into judo training. I was bullied a lot as a kid, and I ended up going to judo training and getting bullied a lot more in the judo. So my judo instructor said to me, let's teach you some karate because you can do some stuff on your own, do kata and kihon and things like that. So later on, after said, oh, I'm going to take you to a legit karate school. So he took me to the school of a guy named Bob Jones, who was a former nightclub bouncer who used his karate for self-defense and for its effectiveness. And then he taught a bunch of guys who were also nightclub bouncers. At 12 or 13 at the time, I was not likely to be a nightclub bouncer, but we trained in the same fairly extreme sort of methods at that time. But he was my introduction to hard style karate. My time with Bob Jones, which ended up quite an extensive amount of time because I would leave and come back. I moved around a lot as a kid. My dad had a lot of different jobs, and we went interstate, and then I joined the army, and so I was all over the place. But I would always come back to train with Bob. And he had a very no-nonsense methodology based on heavy physical training, but it was all based around simple kihon and the basic kata of goju-ryu originally, and then he expanded out into other things like kickboxing and Filipino martial arts and a few other things after that. But my focus, he gave me the basic foundation in karate for me that I was able to then take on in my later training. I joined the Australian military in 1981 when I was just about to turn 22 years old. I was much older than a lot of the other young fellas who were maybe 18 at the time, so they called me Dad. There was another 24-year-old guy they called Granddad at the time. I don't feel like I was so old now that I am a little bit older. I joined the army because jobs were hard to come by. I left school early. I did well at school, but I didn't enjoy school, so I left and went into the workforce. And I ended up in the army by osmosis more than anything else. I spent my first 9 years in a light infantry battalion and then transferred to intelligence corps, where I became a linguist, initially a Japanese linguist, and then later on an Indonesian linguist. So my Nihongo is not very good at the moment because I've had to data dump it to fit in my other language training. I ended up spending 22 years all up in the military. Like I said, I transferred to intelligence corps, spent 13 years there, did some time overseas, ended up with a couple of postings into Indonesia. And then my final posting, I was posted to Indonesia as the Assistant Army Attaché at the Australian Embassy. And then I was poached by a British risk management company to be their man in Jakarta. So I ended up getting out of the Army in 2003 and then commencing my new career in corporate security. My martial arts training early on in my military career was a great help because while we were getting yelled at and told to stand on a line and do push-ups and do all those sorts of things, I'd been doing that since I was 9 years old on a daily basis, so there was really nothing new for me. So I progressed quite quickly. I ended up joining the Army in 81, I was a Lance Corporal in 82, and I was a Full Corporal in 83, and then I remained a Full Corporal for another few years because it was the best job I'd ever had, so I stayed there. I kept my karate training going through that time, and my dojo was the 1st Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment Gymnasium. So I had a swathe of guys who have started their martial arts career in that dojo. ex-servicemen who continue to train to this day. So I ended up working for 4 years in Jakarta initially, mostly doing risk assessments for international businesses there. And then I ended up doing some other work overseas. So I worked in Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Iraq, Afghanistan during that period. My karate training was a bit off and on at that time, but certainly the discipline that came both from my training and from my military service helped me through all of those periods. I've certainly had to use parts of my training in my job over the years, both in the military and in my civilian career afterwards. But none of it has really been punching and kicking. It's all been assessing the situation, getting ahead of it and moving away, or being tactile. And that's the thing about goju-ryu training, is it's a very close range, tactile system rather than long range, long punches and blocking, etc. So, you know, there was one occasion in East Timor when a disgruntled farmer came at me with a machete, and I was able to just have a little chat with him, and everything was okay, and no one got hurt. He didn't get hurt, I didn't get hurt, thankfully. No one had to be shot. And then when I was doing close personal protection, mostly for international sports people, there's a lot of times where you need to act physically but can't rail off against a member of the public who's just there after an autograph or trying to grab a piece of clothing or whatever. So it's the ability then to circumvent that in a non-physical manner, or in a physical manner that doesn't give harm to the aggressor. So that's been an interesting part of my development. So back in 99, 2000, I was seconded to the Special Forces Training Centre in Australia to assist with the development of what was then the Close Quarter Fighting course, which was the Australian Army's unarmed combat course at that time. The Close Quarter Fighting course brought together a group of people who had previously military unarmed combat instructors, as well as people like myself, who was more a civilian martial arts teacher, to try to put together all of that knowledge and expertise into a package that was going to be advantageous for the military. But the problem was that we hadn't been to conflict for some time. Not that that's a problem, that's a good thing not to be in conflict. But I was in the Army in what we call the Great Peace, as opposed to the Great War. So after Vietnam, we didn't have any conflict for some years up into the 90s, into Somalia and then later on East Timor. So none of us had on the ground military experience. So we were able to put some techniques together, but it was all hypothetical at that time. More recently, one of my former karate students, in a classic case of the student becoming the master, he is now, his name is Paul Cale, and he is now a civilian contractor working with the Australian military to run what is now called the Army Combatives Program. He and his cohort are experienced Special Forces soldiers with time on the ground in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. So all of the techniques that they're using and all of the methodology that they're using is battle proven. So some of the very basic techniques from the Army Combatives Program look very much like things like Jodan Agioke. The movements are very similar. The body only moves in a limited amount of ways. So some of those techniques, you look at them and go, oh, I know that one, I've been doing that forever. One of the basic moves in the Army Combative system is very much like Karate's Jodan Agioke, except instead of being a block against a punch like this, what we're doing is coming in this way and hitting into the carotid sinus with that hand there. But we can use that as a striking blow. We can also use it to control if we do a short hook here, and also if we're putting someone up against the wall. Just feel it? Yeah, absolutely. So and that move is exactly the same move as Jodan Agioke. Right. And all of these moves are based on, if you even look at things like Aikido, they've got this hand movement here. Right? And this is the tegatana, the sword hand, which is just a curve this way. If I do that, that's Jodan Agioke. If I do this, it's chudan. If I do that, it's gedan. It's the same. It's the same move. So, and what that is trying to get this arm further out than 90 degrees, and creating a bridge with the pushing muscles and not the antagonistic muscles. So for me, goju is being able to use go and ju at the same time. So there's a lot of people who'll say it's like soft blocking and hard hitting sort of thing. That's two separate things. But hitotsu niraru, we've got to have go and ju happening at the same time. So if you hold my wrist here and just hold under my elbow for stability and just push my arm back to my shoulder, if I'm going like this and I've got all of my muscles working, push, 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 you're bigger than me, and that's going to do that. But if I'm just relaxed and thinking out here, nothing's happening. Now, do that again. There's nothing in that bicep, right? Because all of these muscles are the ones that are being utilised at that time. So it's a matter of relaxing and instigating the muscles that are required for your motion and turning off all the other ones so that they're not holding you back. Because if you do that first one, if I'm going here, I've got 50 that way and 50 this way. So if you're pushing, that's more than 50 this way, and I'm going to lose every time, So all of these moves that we're doing, if I'm going to do that, I'm going to do that move with that same intent, and that actually increases my muscle power without having any more muscle, because it's switching off the muscle that's holding me back, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Bob Jones was one of the early black belts of a guy named Tino Soberano Sensei, who was one of the early Goju Kai, Yamaguchi Goju Kai instructors in Australia, an American ex-serviceman who came out to Australia to teach. So Bob gave me those roots, and I wanted always to do authentic practice. And so I wanted to go to Japan and eventually go to Okinawa. Don't know why I didn't go to Okinawa for a long time. It was easier to get to Tokyo, so I ended up going to Japan a few times and ended up training in Okinawan goju-ryu. I organised an introduction letter to one of the instructors here, who I won't name at the moment because I don't train with him. But I ended up going to visit him, and the guy who was organising my accommodation for Okinawa said to me, "Why don't you come and train with us?" I said, "Well, who are you? You know, why would I come and train with you?" And he said, "Well, my instructor is Taira Masaji Sensei. We're at the Jundokan, and we think you should come and train with us." And I said, "No, I've got this introduction letter, so I can't come and train with you." But when I arrived in Okinawa on the plane, this gentleman was waiting for me at the airport and pretty much kidnapped me and took me around to Taira Sensei's place, and the rest is history. I've been training with Taira Sensei now for a decade and a half. He undid and put back together my karate training. I had been training for 40-something years by that stage, and close to 40 years by the time I started training with him, and I felt like a baby who had never moved my own arms or legs before, but very quickly put it back together again. He's a very practical teacher, and everything that happens needs to work and needs to have a purpose. And so that's what I've learned from him over the last decade and a half. I still teach gojuryu karate, and I still have an involvement in the Army Combatives program, and I teach self-defense and karate sort of as equals, but slightly separate. I think I teach karate now more as a cultural activity than a thing for self-defense or for sport. I certainly don't teach any sport now. I used to do sport myself back in the day, but my training now is just focused on Taira Sensei's method and his thought process in looking at individual waza from the kata and the sequences and whatnot, and try to put them into some realistic context. Taira Sensei was a police officer. He's a retired police officer, and so all of the training that he used to do had to be practical for him. So he was always training with that in mind, making sure that everything that he did was practical. And in the development of his methodology for karate, I was going to say his type of goju-ryu, but it's not really his type of goju-ryu. His goju-ryu is the goju-ryu that he was taught by Miyazato Sensei, and in turn through Miyagi Chojun Sensei. But his way of teaching is quite different than a lot of others. Taira Sensei would seek out people who might be better than him. Bigger guys, big Western guys. The guy who dragged me to the dojo, Glenn McElvride, is about 6'4", and Taira Sensei would use him as his crash test dummy to refine his techniques. Sometimes he would do something that didn't work, and then he would go away and he would come back the next day, and then it would work the next day because he'd worked on body movement, on being able to shift weight. He's only a little guy, and so he has to put more power into his technique without muscle. So he's able to do that by what he calls tendon power rather than muscle power. So that's what he focuses on a lot. Sometimes it's harder for us big guys to be able to do that because we don't move quite as sprightly as he does. But it is the focus of all of his training, is practicality and the ability to generate power over and above what you might think is normally possible. Taira Sensei developed a group of what he calls Renzoku Bunkai exercises for each of the kata. Now, these have been seen by a lot of people who don't train with him, and people call them flow drills and other things. They've given their own names for it, and that's not what they are. The exercises are a little bit like a what-if exercise. So the guy does this, I do my block, what if it doesn't work? What if he does something else, etc. And so Taira Sensei thinks 2 or 3 moves ahead. He's more like chess than checkers, and he's always looking for what might happen if this particular move doesn't work, or if his hand moves in a particular way, or if I'm touching him and his body shifts, what am I going to do? And there's always those things behind it. So the Renzoku Bunkai drills are there to be able to explore all of those options. They're not set in stone, and they change all the time. You'll find that people who learnt one of his drills 10 years ago will come to a class and wonder what's going on because the drill's changed. And the drill hasn't really changed because the drill is the methodology. Some of the moves might have changed just depending on where both of us are in space, me and the opponent. So I think that's a very important point to note, is that these exercises are not just another form of a dance with techniques drilled one after the other. They're trying to explore all of the possibilities in any given engagement. Yeah, so that's used for all of those elbow techniques. For example here, if I want to go in there, rather than try to open you and do that and then you've blocked me, right? What I want to do is close you so that you want to open yourself, and then I'm in, yeah?
Yeah, it's much more effective.
So it's this. It's always tactile. It's never bouncing around at range. Taira Sensei tries to adhere as much as possible to the teaching of his instructor, Miyazato Sensei, as far as us performing the kata in a similar fashion. Everyone performs their kata a little bit differently, and I think if you study, if you look just at the primary students of Miyagi Sensei, whether it's Yagi Sensei or Miyazato Sensei or Taguchi Sensei, all of those guys, even though they all learnt from the same source, they all practice the kata a little bit differently based on body composition, etc. And I think that that's no different today. So I'm currently living in Saitama in Japan. I'm on a cultural activities visa and I'm studying Zen. Training to be a monk at the moment. Talking about authentic practice, that was the authentic practice I was looking for in this space. As an ex-serviceman with some background issues from both my service and my second career in corporate security, in some dangerous places doing silly things. I started doing some mindfulness meditation to try to get my head squared away, and that worked to an extent. But again, I wanted to get into some authentic practice, so I wanted to see where the roots of these practices were. Ended up going back to Zen as a focus, and thought if I'm going to do this, I want to do a deep dive. So on the plane I got, and here I am. So the Zen practice for me is a way of getting me away from things like memory. Most of us, if we've got some sort of angst, it's usually about something that's not happening right now. I'm not on fire, I'm not falling out of a burning building. I'm actually quite okay, but all of my angst comes from things that have already happened to me that I haven't dealt with yet, or things that I'm anticipating in the future that I might, if you're a kid at school doing exams, you haven't done the exam yet, but you get butterflies in the stomach from doing that. So all of our anxiety is generally from things that are in our memory or in our planning ahead. And the Zen practice puts us in a space where we can let go of that thought, and actually be a little bit more in the now. So that's what it does for me. I can focus much better. I'm able to calm those thoughts. Thoughts just appear in consciousness. We don't author our own thoughts. If we authored our own thoughts, then we'd know what we were thinking before we thought it. So they just appear in consciousness, and my brain is one of those ones that sparks off a little bit too often. And the Zen practice is another way to calm that activity by just letting those thoughts go. Instead of grasping hold of thoughts and having a conversation with them, just to open the hand and let them go. The practice is called shikantaza, which is sitting with full intent, just sitting to the exclusion of everything else. So we sit in the temple 10 hours a day around, about. From 4:30 in the morning we get up, we start sitting at 10 to 5, and our last sitting session finishes about 8:30 in the evening, with a few activities through the day like meal times and a bit of work. So there is a concept in Zen called no gaining mind, which means that we shouldn't be out to gain something from the practice, whatever it is. The practice itself is complete. Now you may or may not get to realization or enlightenment at the end of it, but the focus is on the practice. So I guess the corollary with karate training is that it also isn't something that we have to have a goal or an aim for. It's something that we just do. And we can be happy just doing that. And if we get somewhere, that's great. But we don't have to be doing it for a competition or doing it for rank advancement or whatever. Rank advancement will come if I keep training hard and long enough. So our karate training should be something that we just do, just like just sitting in Zen.